All right, good morning to everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin, may I take this time to remind everyone of our house rules for today's event. To all our participants, please be respectful, treat the presenter and other attendees with respect, avoid interrupting, making rude comments, or engaging in side conversations that are visible to everyone. During the Q&A, please use the Q&A chat box function. Kindly type your questions briefly and clearly. Participants are also requested to virtually remain in the webinar until the end. We also would like to remind you that the webinar will be recorded and uploaded by the organizers, but participants are not allowed to record this event. If you have any concerns or inquiries, you may direct them to the Q&A function. Lastly, please continue to observe proper decorum throughout the sessions. The organizers strive to ensure a high level of security for your personal data, and the organizers will comply with the Philippines Data Privacy Act, governing data that was gathered as part of the registration process during this event and the evaluation process. Once again, good morning to all our participants who have joined us in today's event. Facts Asia and the Foundation for the National Interest warmly welcome all of you to this webinar, A Date with Trump, US-ASEAN Relations Amid Shifting Priorities. At this event, we are going to reflect on the shifting priorities under the second Trump administration as it becomes more crucial than ever to assess the emerging challenges and opportunities, including discussing strategies to strengthen the US-ASEAN vital partnership for regional stability and growth. Our esteemed panel will delve into the changing landscape of US-ASEAN relations by examining geopolitical strategy, economic trade-offs, and diplomatic dancing in the region. So no worry, this isn't your typical dinner and movie date for Valentine's Day. Imagine it like a geopolitical dance, but with more strategic ambiguity and fewer roses. And keep in mind that unlike any other healthy relationship, there may be some conflict and unexpected turns, but we are all here to figure it out together. My name is Ana Patricia Saberon. I am a faculty member of Ateneo de Naga University. It is a pleasure to be with you all here despite the gloomy weather. And I will be your host and moderator for today's program. Once again, today's webinar is brought to you by Facts Asia and the Foundation for the National Interest. This discussion takes place at a pivotal point. Fundamental concerns regarding the future of multilateral participation, regional security, and economic stability in the Indo-Pacific are brought up by the changing dynamics of U.S. foreign policy under the Trump administration. ASEAN has shaped diplomatic, economic, and cultural contact in the area for many years, serving as a pillar of U.S. strategy. But there are important ramifications for ASEAN countries and their long-standing relations with Washington, as the United States refocuses its strategic priorities with an emphasis on America First. Policymakers, academics, diplomats, and anybody else with an interest in regional stability and global governance must all comprehend these changes. Today, we have three esteemed speakers who will be given 20 minutes each to discuss their views and insights. Before I introduce them, our organizers have requested a quick photo session. Florence, please let us know once you have captured a screenshot. May I request our speakers to please turn on their cameras? Thank you. Now, let us start in our discussion as I introduce our first speaker for today's webinar. Professor Charmaine Willoughby is a professor and chair of the Department of International Studies at De La Salle University in Manila, Philippines. She is also a fellow at Carnegie China and Agora Strategy and serves on the editorial boards of several academic journals. She is a member of the Foundation for the National Interests Board of Trustees and an expert in the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Asia Pacific's Asia Strategic Foresight Group. Her areas of specialization are alliances, maritime security, security cooperation, and critical international relations theory. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Dr. Charmaine Willoughby.
Thank you so much, Anna. Good morning to everyone. I'm very grateful to Fax Asia and the Foundation for the National Interest for initiating this webinar and for inviting me to speak. I don't know if it's a good thing that I'm the first speaker because that makes it an equally difficult task, but I shall do my very best. I also would like to thank Florence and Lisa, who are working behind the scenes. I'm very happy to be in this panel with very good friends of mine, Greg and Chuping. And I hope we can all treat this as if we were in a coffee shop and just exchanging insights about what's happening to the world. And I'm pretty sure that that is exactly what's going to happen in the next hour or so. So I have about 20 minutes or so to give my thoughts about the US-ASEAN relationship under the Trump 2.0 administration. And I think I'd like to put my remarks into context by emphasizing that, we've experienced a dizzying series of events. I mean, if we were to look at the last 10 years alone, we have really been pulled in so many different directions. So, 10 years back. So let's start with 2015, 2016, around that time. That was the landmark event of the arbitration award in favor of the Philippines. This is in regard to the South China Sea issue. 2016 was also when Trump came into office in the United States. 2016 was also when President Duterte became president here in the Philippines. So it was a wave of elected populist leaders that we've seen, not just in the Philippines, not just in the United States, but elsewhere in the world. In the last 10 years, we've also all been under house arrest. No thanks to COVID. We've experienced what has been happening and continues to happen in Myanmar, in Ukraine. We found ourselves still within the pandemic. The pandemic never seemed to end, even though now looking back, it's like, just a couple of years actually in our lifetime. And then we find ourselves back again under the Trump administration when he won the US elections late last year. So, as if the last couple of years have never actually happened, we're hearing once again, making America great again, right? So it's the same kind of slogan, same kinds of images that are being drawn out all over. Now, you and I, all of us here, are in the business of explaining and understanding the world. There are some givens in this so-called world that we find ourselves in. We live in a world with power asymmetries. There are great powers, there are middle powers, there are small powers, and there's the rest of the world. It also seems like, and in many instances, it seems like, we live in a world where the strong seems to do what they can, and the weak must suffer what they must, right? So this is your typical the typical lesson that we draw from our early days in studying international relations, that, well, this is just the world as it is. The strong will do whatever they can, and they usually get away with it, and the powerless are left to just, shrug their shoulders and grin and bear it. So in the short time that I have to share my thoughts with you today, I thought I would make it my argument that to explain the world out there, right, we can actually draw lessons from the classics, from the discipline of international relations about two things. Number one, why states behave or misbehave the way that they do. And number two, we can also draw lessons from the discipline of international relations about what regions like Southeast Asia, with small and middle powers, what we can do to come out of the next 4 years alive and in one piece, more or less, right? So essentially, what I want to do, since I'm the first speaker in our webinar, what I want to do is provide an overview of what may be happening in the world today. And I'm trying to anchor it in concepts that are drawn from international relations. Okay, so for explanations for the state of geopolitics today, I've been able to draw at least 3 explanations from the discipline. The first one is in regard to the existence, persistence, and omnipresence of this thing called anarchy. This is a basic concept that we've been taught as first-year students in international relations, that states are the main actors in international affairs. Their main motivation is to survive, and they realize early on, states realize early on, that in their drive to survive, they can actually not rely on anybody else because we live in a self-help system. We live in an anarchic system. This kind of system operates in the fact that there are always high levels of uncertainty, and it is in our best interest, or in states' best interest, to actually mistrust others because we don't really know what their motivations are. So there are high levels of uncertainty and mistrust, but that also means that there are high chances of miscalculations. Right? So we will misinterpret and misperceive the actions of others, and these action and reaction will always result in some kind of negative interaction between and amongst states. The long story short is that if we are using realism as a framework to explain geopolitics today, then selfishness is actually in states' best interest. So in the context of US-ASEAN relations, right, when we hear America first, right, this slogan always gets non-Americans riled up. But shouldn't Americans make America first, thereby making their country, at least in their eyes, great again? Who else but Americans ought to put America first? Filipinos cannot be expected to put America first because, well, we're not Americans anyway. Don't get me wrong, though. I'm not going to start wearing a MAGA hat, Make America Great Again, later today. But all I'm trying to point out is that discourses such as this, or narratives such as this, what Trump is saying these days, this is actually no different from, let's say, President Duterte's quote unquote independent foreign policy back in the day, right? Because, to mention an independent foreign policy is actually much pretty self-explanatory, because every sovereign entity already inherently can exercise independent foreign policy. So the point that I'm trying to make is that if we are using the concept or the backdrop of realism, there's actually nothing new with what's happening in the world today. It's business as usual. This is how geopolitics has been run since time immemorial, and this is something that we can expect in the near future, even in the long run. I hate to say it, but because I'm not a realist, but realism does offer us some, quote unquote, some timeless truths about how the world works. Realism is able to explain, to a certain extent, why states behave the way that they do. But think of it this way: if everybody acts on their own selfish interests, we'd actually end up living in a Hobbesian state of nature. So another explanation for why we are where we are in international relations comes from from another school of thought. And this one is from the power of institutions. And this is where I'm moving now to the second sub point that I'd like to make in today's webinar. The power of institutions can actually be rooted in the fact that this system that we find ourselves in has been created in the aftermath of the Second World War. The emergence of this so-called rules-based order was actually created in the image of the United States. It makes sense because in 1945, it was the United States that was one of the victors of World War II. Institutions were put at the centerpiece because of the belief and the faith that the presence, existence, and pervasiveness of institutions can actually minimize the effects of anarchy via cooperation. So these institutions were envisioned to be the platforms where states can cooperate with each other. So there have been a spate of multilateral frameworks since 1945. Despite that, there's also been a couple of problems associated with the power of institutions, such as, there's always the possibility of actors cheating on each other, on making sure that they have short-term gains, relative gains versus absolute gains. A lot of these multilateral frameworks that we have today are still pretty much state-driven. So they are used to advance states' interests instead of really ensuring that everybody can benefit from cooperative mechanisms. Diving a little deeper into the literature, we also recognize that within this realm of the power of institutions, we touch on the ideas and the concepts of the hegemonic stability theory. The fact that there is stability that we've experienced since 1945 because there is a hegemon, a superpower that pretty much, ensures that the entire system hangs together. But some scholars have also pointed out, great powers are not great powers forever. Great powers, like all things in the world, rise and fall. So there's an end to superpowers' hegemony. Now, as we know, the rules-based order is now hanging by a thread. This has been, our suspicion since the 1970s, and since then, it's really just been, evidence upon evidence mounting up into this now bigger idea that maybe the rules-based order is not worth fighting for. It's evolving into something else altogether. And both the Trump 1 and Trump 2.0 administrations seem to really question or challenge the post-1945 rules-based order. The US appears to be turning its back on the very architecture that it has created, this by disdaining multilateralism and preferring bilateral negotiations or bilateral interactions. We've seen this in how he has withdrawn the United States from a variety of multilateral agreements in his first month in office. Another evidence that the rules-based order is now hanging by a thread, apart from the fact that the United States is seemingly turning its back on the very architecture it created, is that China is also offering its own version of an international system. However, whether or not China's version will actually gain traction remains to be known, because studies have demonstrated that China needs to improve its soft power capabilities. The United States has been able to engage different parties, different actors around the world since the creation version of the rules-based order because of its soft power. But China has not been able to perfect, if I can call it that, the soft power that America has been able to do. So China is offering its version of a rules-based order, but whether or not that will gain traction remains to be known. Meanwhile, the rest of the world, like the Philippines, like many countries in Southeast Asia, are trying to bolster this already crumbling system because we see this as a way to have continued participation in international affairs. So far, what I've offered to you are two different schools of thought in terms of how we can make sense of what is happening in the world out there, why there's an intensification of competition between and amongst great powers, and small and medium countries like those in Southeast Asia are caught in the middle. A third explanation, though, still drawing from the literature, um, is something that the catchphrase would be "world of our making," echoing Nicholas Onuf's classic work in 1989, and also drawing from Alexander Vent's seminal article in 1992-1993. And essentially, the argument here is that if anarchy is what states make of it, then actually we we need not be in a self-help world. We can make, unmake, and remake our world to ensure that our own interests are advanced. This is actually very powerful and very empowering, but we need to apply this in the real world, in the world out there, within bounds and within reason. Because China may think that it is actually simply remaking the post-1945 system after all, right? But the logic of constructivism is that we need not be in an anarchic environment. We can actually have different ways of interacting with each other. So this is a good intro to the second main point that I'd like to make for today. The first point that I've made has to do with explaining the world out there, drawing from the discipline of international relations. The second point that I'd like to make is to highlight what regions like Southeast Asia, with small and medium powers within, what we can do to survive in a world where great powers seem to endlessly compete with each other. This is where Southeast Asia can really shine, and ASEAN can do a whole lot, even though there's an understanding and a recognition that ASEAN is also pretty much challenged in so many different things, structurally, and so on. But nonetheless, despite all of those shortcomings and weaknesses, there are several things that Southeast Asia and ASEAN can do to improve our stake in the rules-based order, no matter the fact that this RBO is already being severely challenged. The first thing that we can do in Southeast Asia is in recognition of the fact that supply chains have been weaponized heavily. We've seen this particularly during the COVID years, and we've come to the realization that we do need to diversify our supply chains, and our reliance on supply chains needs to go beyond the great powers. This is very challenging because of embedded dependencies for specifically manufacturing capabilities and critical resources. And because of these challenges, right, the usual results would be a rise in friendshoring, where we source goods from countries that are our allies or our friends. So embedded dependencies can result in an increase in friendshoring, but also in moves towards industrial policies, where governments provide assistance to specific industries to achieve economic goals. There are good and bad things about this, and we can talk more about this during the open forum. But anyway, so the point that I'm trying to make is that because of the challenges of embedded dependencies, right, diversifying supply chains may be a little bit difficult to do and can, in fact, escalate geopolitical tensions. Arrangements like RCEP can be tapped into in recognition of integrated supply chains. It can arrangements like this can accelerate reshoring or moving manufacturing or services back to a company's home country in Southeast Asia. It's actually regional economies like Vietnam that can win big time under these circumstances, because the main drivers of investments in, for instance, EVs, electronic vehicles, and electronics manufacturing industries, would encourage reshoring in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia. So that's one thing that we can do. We can work to diversify supply chains. But another thing that ASEAN can do would be to focus on climate. I know that there are some big countries that deny that climate change is actually a thing, but for Southeast Asia, climate change is a clear and present danger. It's an existential threat. So those of us in the region must strengthen climate resilient infrastructures, develop sustainable industries, revise financial models in support of smallholder operators, and enhance regional coordination. We can also unify green standards, such as, for example, eco-labeling systems, especially in key industries like agriculture and manufacturing, which can simplify certification for producers, address consumer confusion, and boost ASEAN's global competitiveness. So those are two things that we can do to survive the next 4 years under Trump. Southeast Asia can focus on diversifying supply chains, can cooperate in terms of addressing climate change. The third is we could also put food security front and center and on top of our agenda. Platforms like ASEAN can do very well to address this, especially in regard to initiatives to innovate agricultural industry. Food security also puts at the center civil maritime security programs, taking into account those non-traditional security issues and the role of women, for instance, as stakeholders in terms of boosting a community's or a country's food security. I can go on and on about this, but I'd like to give the other speakers some time as well to share their very important points. So I'd like to conclude by saying that uncertainty is rife in international relations. In fact, the entire discipline has been created with the concept of uncertainty right at the very heart of it. Right? But we can minimize the effects of anarchy through cooperation. There are, of course, advantages and disadvantages to how to cooperate with others in the international system, but it's high time for countries in Southeast Asia, for regions like Southeast Asia, to boost spoke-to-spoke connections instead of simply being connected to the hub. And here, of course, I'm speaking about the hub and spokes model that we've all come to learn about in school. It's high time for the spokes to speak to each other and to reach out and cooperate with each other. So, Anna, I think I will stop here. I'd welcome comments, questions later on. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Charmaine. So, um, you have actually given us like a very short review of IR theories, from anarchy to the power of institutions, and of course, the logic of constructivism. And I would just like to highlight the later part of your remarks when you talked about what can Southeast Asia do, because I think this is what our audience is really looking for. So number one is you said that we need to diversify our supply chains. And this can be done through arrangements like RCEP. Number two, Southeast Asia can focus on climate. How do we do this? We can develop sustainable industries, unify green standards. And number three, we need to put food security on top of our agenda in Southeast Asia. And this opens up other opportunities such as civil maritime security programs, and role of women in contribution of this agenda. And finally, you emphasize that cooperation is something that we should strengthen, because cooperation can minimize anarchy, and the spokes should be able to step up and speak to each other and further intensify cooperation among them. All right, so thank you so much once again, Dr. Charmaine Willoughby. So we're now moving on to our second speaker. So Dr. Gregory Winger is an assistant professor in the School of Political and International Affairs at the University of Cincinnati and a faculty fellow in the Center for Cyber Strategy. His research examines security cooperation and how collective security institutions like alliances are responding to the challenges of cyber conflict. He is a former Fulbright scholar to the Philippines and remains active in Indo-Pacific affairs. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Gregory Winger.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you to FACS for putting on this terrific event. It's lovely to speak with you all today. I am honored and privileged to be on this panel with good friends and well-respected colleagues. It is a trying time in a lot of ways for all of us. Vladimir Lenin said there are decades in which nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. We are very much in that latter situation. And being able to talk through it with fellow colleagues, well-respected points of view from Asia, around the world, and to just even walk through and talk through the world as we see it and where it's going is a terrific opportunity. I'm looking forward to the discussion later, and I will just try and keep my remarks relatively brief because I want to prioritize that discussion as well. It's always difficult going after someone like Charmaine because now I'm thinking so much about all the excellent points and perspectives that she raised that my own views are like, I spent now more time thinking about that. But what I want to do with my comments is kind of focus on the US foreign policy perspective and some of the unique attributions of the second Trump administration, certainly throughout the context of US foreign policy, throughout the history of it, but even in a lot of ways, how this second administration is looking to be different from even that first administration. And when we initially were asked to think about the question of what does US-ASEAN relations look like under the second Trump administration, the challenge is I'm not sure how to talk about something that doesn't really exist yet. And while that might be the situation of a early administration, I think it is also indicative of a larger challenge that we are all going to be facing over the next several months and years of how do we face and think about US engagement on a global scale in a completely new context, and often where that engagement does not exist. I'm willing to bet many people on this panel in the participants have worked with US embassies before, have worked with USAID, the State Department, and we're seeing a change in the concepts of US engagement in a way that is unique. And I will revisit that before later on. I wanted to focus on kind of like five-ish big changes that I see as kind of unique to this Trump administration within the context of historical US foreign policy, and think about how those may or may not manifest in ASEAN. To begin with, I think there's actually, I don't want to call it good news necessarily, but there's an opportunity here. Specifically, when we look at historical cases of tension between ASEAN and the United States, or certainly different administrations like the Obama administration or like the Carter administration, has dealt with fundamental different views between how the United States places different values on governance, liberal democracy, rights of people, individual, minority rights, political rights, civil rights, and that those, as well as other human rights, have occasionally been points of tension between the United States and its engagement with ASEAN, largely because of when you had a US administration that prioritized those issues, even potential partners' points of cooperation in terms of economics and security would become quite difficult because you get talked about human rights. That was absolutely the case with the Obama administration and the Duterte administration. What is an opportunity here is those are not concerns for the Trump administration. Issues like social justice, human rights, freedom of the press, the use of weaponized judicial systems against political opponents, those are things that the Trump administration is seemingly okay with. And in a lot of ways, some models of governance that we see in ASEAN are going to start looking a lot closer to the United States. So at least these historical points of tension won't necessarily be there, and obstacles to certain bilateral relationships between the United States and certain ASEAN governments, leaders, might not be there, which creates new opportunities for potential collaboration that historically have not been there. And we could think of cases potentially like Cambodia as an example of something that might not have been possible with a Obama administration, certainly can become possible with a Trump 2.0 administration. That said, well, certainly I'm sure there are people in countries in the region who will be thankful to not hear talk that about human rights again. The downside is the United States, at least at this point, doesn't look like it's going to be doing much talking to anybody in the region. And not just the region, but even globally. And this is that second major transition that I think is really important and going to be, in a lot of ways, a rude awakening for all of us. And that's, what does the absence of the United States look like? The Trump administration is extremely inwardly looking. The overarching goal of its project, of its self-conception, is focused on internal US governance, the US economy, how the US runs, how its government runs. And foreign policy, as much as there's dabbling, is not a priority. And it's not just a priority in terms of like allocating time, but allocating resources and institutions. For example, the closing of USAID is massive. That is going to have huge consequences with how the United States engages with the globe. Simply US presence and being able to go to conferences, workshops, events, and have a regular US presence to develop initiatives and projects, charities, outreach, education, that we'd have partners with the United States government through State Department, through USAID, through others. Those are not necessarily going to be there. In fact, I would be more and more skeptical of them being there. And that is crazy in some ways, right? We could have always argued about like the priorities of an American engagement or which regions the United States would prioritize in terms of its involvement. What does a US look like? What does the world look like when the United States doesn't choose to be involved? When those institutions of engagement, like the State Department, are shrinking? Just today, I looked at the State Department website, and roughly half of US ambassadorships around the world are currently vacant. And that's not vacant in terms of there's been nominees and they're waiting for approval. There is no nominee, there is no current ambassador. And why that matters is because not only does that concentrate a lot of into the elites of what the White House does or the National Security Council, but presence is absent. And this is one of those issues I think is going to be uniquely trying for ASEAN as well, because within the ASEAN way, one of the things that makes you successful in this region and in regional affairs is just showing up. showing up counts for so much, being in those discussions, seeing how they evolve, helping to build and establish projects, knowing that history with the shrinking of US foreign policy institutions, that presence is going to be lacking more and more. Major initiatives that have been key points of pride and cooperation between the United States and the region, for example, Agent Orange cleanup in Vietnam. What happens when those projects stop, or the funding stops, or the engagement stops? And this is also just on a global scale a really interesting question because we are seeing the United States turn away from global engagement in a way that has not happened since probably 100 years ago, before World War II. Again, since World War II, the United States has played a leading role in world affairs as a global actor. It has been involved. Madeleine Albright talks about the United States as the indispensable power. Well, what happens when the United States chooses not to do that? To just be uninvolved. And so that is going to be a major challenge and a major change, and especially in regions like ASEAN, what happens when the US just isn't there? And so, in that way, I mean, the joke is kind of, again, it's Valentine's Day, date with Trump. Maybe the movie for this is he's just not that into you. And I think a lot of countries around the world are going to have that realization. Ukraine is facing that right now. A lot of others, it's not antipathy, it's just disinterest. Another major question is where those interests exist and where they're driving. What are the priorities of this new administration? And this is, again, unique for US foreign policy because, well, again, international priorities do shift from administration to administration, from era to era. You could think about those who prioritize human rights, those who prioritize security, presidents who prioritize building that liberal international order, presidents like Truman. With the Trump administration, as much as there is engagement, the priority looks like it's going to be extremely economically driven. Economically over values, economics over international world order, arguably economic over even security concerns, for example, right? The goal is to help build and restore a vision of the American economy. And so we are going to see the prioritization of trade as the number one international agenda issue. And that is something that probably does not necessarily go well for ASEAN, unfortunately, because it's not just trade, it's a mercantile, anti-globalized version of trade. The Trump administration, and not alone, has recognized that globalization and free trade have fundamentally cost huge swaths of the US economy, a large number of jobs in manufacturing. I live in Ohio, I grew up in Cleveland. I remember when the steel mills, so the heavy industry closed, and parts of my state are still devastated that they have never recovered from that. Dealing with that and restoring those, or at least making an effort to do that, is the number one priority. It is seen as a key mission, and it will become a shaping agenda in terms of how the Trump administration doesn't just deal with, Mexico or Canada, but everyone. The trade is the number one question will be in any bilateral conversation. What's the trade? What's the dollar amounts? And why that is problematic is because under different US administrations, like the Biden administration, ASEAN had a significant potential to build and gain economically through friendshoring, especially as different major manufacturers, different major companies in the US and abroad are looking to divest in China to diversify the supply chain. ASEAN was going to be a major beneficiary of that as a friend-sharing region outside of China who the United States could work with allies and partners. And while that still might be the case, the question is now, well, these aren't China. The question is, well, why isn't this the United States? And so even within ASEAN, you could think about how many different economies, different elements, from call centers to manufacturing, have benefited from that kind of type of cooperation. But now, instead of that being a benefit, this is now a question of why aren't those jobs back in the United States? And so more and more that will be a major issue. And again, a potential point of challengement in terms of economic cooperation between the US and ASEAN, instead of being a benefit, can now be seen as a potential challenge to this new administration. Charmaine did a fantastic job talking about the realpolitics of this new world order, thinking about realism and going back to Thucydides. and the question of, or at least the conception of the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. That, as we have seen, is a fairly accurate representation of how the Trump administration, at least Donald Trump himself, views world affairs. That this is a question of hierarchy. Hierarchy exists in world affairs, and there are great powers, there are middle powers, and then the small powers who are relevant. And the question is, hierarchy matters. It is a question of great powers do what they want, others have to suffer what they want and must and endure. What is interesting about that is that idea of a hierarchical nature of geopolitics is not unique to the Trump administration. It is something, if we take a step back, if we strip away the nature of the countries, this idea of great powers get what they want, it's shared with Putin, it's shared with China and Xi Jinping. It's not that dissimilar from Modi in India. It's not that different from Erdogan in Turkey. And as much as we are seeing this issue of hierarchy, one of the things, and I will visit this in a bit, is the question of a concert system. To what extent is this great powers or large powers who try to shape international affairs to their agenda, who work together as needed through concert systems, but otherwise shape it as they see fit? Why that matters for ASEAN is, in a fundamental way, it appears that the Trump administration does not believe in the liberal international order, does not want to support the liberal international order, does not value it. And so that is a problem because, in a classic cost benefit sense, who benefited the most from that liberal international order was often middle powers, because it both created them the opportunity and the space to prosper and to grow without having necessarily to worry about rivals or threats or other great powers coming over. And so, as Charmaine mentioned, the ability of middle powers to work together through organizations like ASEAN is going to be essential as a counterbalance or as a counterweight in some ways to the redominance and reassertion of great power prominence and priority and prerogatives. And so that is something that we will see is to what extent do great powers, as much as they compete, share a common interest in the prerogatives and the benefits of great powers. And this is the last point I want to focus on, and it's more of a hypothetical to think about. And that is, we right now hear a lot about US-China competition. The United States just placed large tariffs on it. We talk about the trade wars. We talk about rivals with power and dominance of world affairs, great power competition. But what is the nature of that competition? And what's the point of that competition? Because that's not necessarily answered the same way by everyone in the United States or in every administration. Is the point of competition, what is the cause of the competition? Is this about different worldviews about how China and the United States view that the world should work? Is this about values between like free speech, democracy versus techno-authoritarianism and communism of China? Is that a values-based competition? Or is this just great power rivalry of you wear red, we wear blue, my team versus your team? And as much as that's the case, why compete? And what's the ideal outcome of that competition? Is it to win? Is it to dominate world affairs? Is the goal of competition to shape world affairs, to reestablish, to have that liberal world order win versus that rival Chinese system? Well, is the point of competition a deal? And this is what I want to highlight as a potential outcome that bears thinking about now is if the goal of competition between the United States and China, at least from the Trump administration's perspective, in terms of the trade war, in terms of disengagement, if the goal is the deal, what does that look like for regions like ASEAN? Is this the reestablishment of a concert system of great powers having their own spheres of influence and them being respected? Because that is a real possibility. I think it's worth noting that in terms of the tariff wars, we were talking about a 25% tariff on Mexico, a 25% tariff on Canada, but only a 10% tariff on China. Even just now, today, the suspension of TikTok in the United States, this major national security rallying cry, that just got lifted, and TikTok is now back available in the App Store in the United States. what happens if the goal of this competition is the deal? What does that look like for ASEAN? And what does it look like when ASEAN is not the battleground between rival great powers, but where you have a potential rival like the United States saying, that's China's sphere of influence, or that's someone else's sphere of influence. We was taking a step back. That's just a thought experiment at this point, but it's something that is worth considering because if we're talking about a concert system of great powers, if we're looking at Europe, if we're looking at American disengagements, those are real possibilities that need to be considered, and certainly something that regional governments need to take seriously, think about, and start building repercussions and systems to deal with. I look forward to talking more in the Q&A. Thank you all very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Winger, for your remarks. So you have actually pointed out 5 big changes um, in terms of the US foreign policy. Human rights and social justice may not be in the agenda of the United States. If in the past they've been talking about this with ASEAN, for now they might be, silent about this. Number 2, which I think is very interesting, is the question of what happens when the United States, does not engage in global affairs. And this has not been seen since the end of World War II. What happens when foreign policy is actually not a priority for the United States? For example, as mentioned, USAID is on danger of being dismantled. So it seems crazy. So what does the world look like when the United States does not participate? And this is an issue for ASEAN because in a region like us, where showing up counts so much, and if the United States does not show up, then what happens? Number 3, the priority of the United States seemed to be economics over anything, over values, over security. But the thing is, this trade as a priority for the United States may actually be a different version of what we know. So you use the term anti-globalized trade. Fourth, Dr. Winger talked about hierarchy, how hierarchy exists in world affairs, and the question of to what extent will great powers actually clear what's the nature of the competition, what's the goal, and in that sense, what's also the consequences for ASEAN. So those are the 5 big changes outlined by Dr. Gregory Winger. Thank you so much. Moving on, we will now have our third speaker. Dr. Chi-Ping Hu is a senior fellow of the East Asian International Relations Caucus, a member of the Asia-Pacific Nuclear Advisory Council, an editorial member of the AUPIR and Politics series, Amsterdam University Press, and research fellow at the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies. From 2019 to 2020, she was a member of the Defense White Paper team of the Malaysian Ministry of Defense. And from 2021 to 2022, she served on the Consultative Council on Foreign Policy, Malaysian Foreign Ministry. Dr. Hu's research focuses on Korean Peninsula security and the security economics linkages between Northeast and Southeast Asia. Ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning, everyone. And for those who join elsewhere, good afternoon as well. So thank you so much, Facts Asia, for inviting us to join this conversation. And I will keep my remark short and succinct so that we allow for more time for discussion. So I'm glad that both Charmaine and Gregory, we bring different things to the table. So I would like to cover what has not been discussed. And I would like to frame the discussion by first highlighting the 3 main challenges the Trump second administration would bring to Southeast Asia. So first, I think, is the inconsistent policy. So we know from his first administration that he often rolled back on some policy direction. And for example, on the Korean Peninsula, the fire and fury in 2017 turned into summit diplomacy, meeting Kim Jong-un 3 times in 1 year. So that is something that we need to prepare for when we want to expect what Trump would bring to us. And speaking of, just now, Greg has also highlighted several cases, but I would also like to mention about the world conflicts in which the US actually can have impact on. For example, the Secretary of Defense actually walked back on his statement related to Ukraine after the call between Trump and Putin. And of course, that's quickly followed up by talk between Trump and also Zelensky. So not only that, we also see that US, even though they promised they would do more for the Indo-Pacific, and Southeast Asia is a great part of it, but how much that will they will come and actually be present. For example, even Biden doesn't join ASEAN Summit and East Asian Summit much. So missing for the past 2 years. So would Trump come this year? Malaysia is the ASEAN chair for 2025 this year. And there is a rumor that Xi Jinping would attend. So that would prompt Trump to come to Malaysia to attend ASEAN meetings. So this is something that we wouldn't know, but the government needs to be more prepared. The second challenges of Trump's government in Southeast Asia is his highly transactional engagement style. And sometimes it comes with a sort of a punishment. So very punitive as to if you don't follow the policy direction put forward by the government, for example, in foreign policy and also in defense. So even to the US allies and partners, so just now Greg also mentioned how Canada was imposed with a much higher tariff in comparison to China. So even to other long-time partners like Japan and South Korea. So the US alliance issue, how much burden each ally should share, has always been the main issue whenever Trump comes into power. So, and that said, we are also looking at how that would mean for the Philippines. So EDCA has been signed, and more bases are supposed to be built and maintained. So what would that change, and would that affect Philippines' posture in South China Sea? So these are so many issues that we need to take care of. And thirdly is the unilateral and somehow almost quite imposing policy. So I think economic trade tariffs, these are the issues that we know Trump has launched in full force since his first day in office. But we also need to be mindful about the continuing policy from the Biden administration, and that especially on the export control. So Charmaine mentioned about semiconductor supply chain. And to be honest, Southeast Asia is a very critical part of this semiconductor supply chain. We participate in manufacturing, the electronics, which Malaysia is have a strength in, and also quantum computers, which is belong to the Japan and South Korea, the high-tech partners. So with more specific country-specific control imposed, for example, few months ago, the Department of Commerce of the United States imposed new regulations as to how Malaysian technological companies couldn't source more than 40% of its raw material from China. So all of this would have ripple effects all over in the region, especially for those countries, including Malaysia and Vietnam, that work very closely with both the United States and China. And in fact, many of the China source material technology, import-export involving US and Southeast Asia, a lot of them were actually coming from the US corporation. So how would Trump trying to balance all of this is also something that we should pay attention to. Aside from export control on sensitive technologies, critical mineral is another sector that we need to pay attention to. Canada intends to use their critical mineral resource to renegotiate with the US on the tariff negotiation, for example. So how then Southeast Asia should respond to the 3 main challenges that the US could brought to Southeast Asia? I think first, in regards to their potentially inconsistent policy, they say one thing, they may roll back up. So I think what we need to do is to be adaptive. So we need to taking taking it cautiously and in preparation for a 180 shift in the policy direction. Not only in Southeast Asia, so we also look at how the other issues in other regions like Ukraine-Russia war, the Gaza conflict, and also on the Korean Peninsula, because Trump said he may want to talk to Kim Jong-un again. So does that mean Southeast Asia would be open for a mediation role? Are we open to promote more peace building and such? So this is a direction that regional countries should pay attention to. Secondly, on the highly transactional engagement style that Trump administration is likely to introduce, we can be more authentic, just be Southeast Asian, just be ASEAN, and just be our taking care of our respective national interests, like Charmaine has highlighted. So I think in that sense, we need to hold not only the US and China accountable for their words, but we also can diversify, work with more partners like Japan, South Korea, and Australia, New Zealand, and many other countries. And to think that we are actually holding much more leverages and advantages because we are the region where we have the convening power, and we are the one that bring many regional powers together through ASEAN meetings or through other functional and practical cooperation in specific areas like maritime security, cybersecurity, and many other areas. So this is something that we should do more, having more inclusive multilateralism. And thirdly, on the unilateral and potentially imposing policy coming from the US, how are we going to do or overcome these challenges? It to be more proactive. So Malaysia is convenient because we are the ASEAN chair this year. Prime Minister Anwar has advocated for a sustainable and inclusive policy direction. But at the same time, we are also managing the ongoing Myanmar crisis, the South China Sea dispute. Would Anwar being very ambitious, wanting to make progress in the COC negotiation, and the upcoming workshop on ASEAN-China Maritime Law Enforcement workshop would be convened in Malaysia. So how would US view then Malaysia's role in trying to bring China, socializing with China through the ASEAN platform? And if what Gregory Winger said is true, that US is more inward looking, so no matter what we do, doesn't matter. And with the cancellation of US aid, it really seems like the case where the US influence would slightly diminish, if not reduce, in our region. So how then we are going to have a more practical and also more specific ways of handling the multiple potential challenges coming from a highly uncertain second Trump administration. So Facts Asia actually sent us a very useful guide question. So I'm going to just spend maybe 2 minutes on each of the session. The first is on the political dimension. Does ASEAN centrality matter when it comes to engaging with Trump administration? So I think we need to convince the US, and I believe that the US stakeholders, not only the US embassies in this region, but also the many American corporations like American Chambers of Commerce, they are the one that plays a role and convince the government back home in DC on the importance of continue to engage with ASEAN countries. So US remain the top 2 trade partners of each and every ASEAN member states. So we just need to show that we are relevant and we are important economically, if that is the number 1 priority. So coming to the economic dimension, I think I haven't seen the news yet on how would Trump deal with the Indo-Pacific economic framework proposed by Biden. But I do think that just like how Trump withdrew from Trans-Pacific Partnership that was negotiated under the Obama administration, highly likely Indo-Pacific economic framework would not be continued. So this is again another type of uncertainty in this continuation of past policy that Southeast Asia and many other countries in the world need to deal with as we go on. So bilateral trade agreements might be the preferred way, but be mindful of the export controls, tariff that might prove to be difficult and challenging as well. I think if anything, ASEAN need to be, again, bringing back to my third point just now, which is to be more proactive. So we can try to propose a framework that the US would deem maximizing the profit and gains for the US in the region. For example, semiconductor and other technological advancement that Southeast Asia can actually fill in that gap for the US if they do intend to continue the technological decoupling from China, for example. So speaking of the technological dimension, DeepSeek is since its introduction in January, it has dominated forums and online discussions about how are we going to deal with this. But I think the challenges is very similar when ChatGPT came out. So as we allow ChatGPT to improve over time, so now data security is the main concern. So some countries already banned DeepSeek, just like how they banned TikTok in the beginning. So I think for every country, we need to set up our own task force and study group to really evaluate to what extent the same type of AI technology, whether the application is in civilian or in military. So I think we need more deliberation on how are we going to evaluate whether it is a threat to our national security. So in terms of the strategic ambiguity, which is often the level being put on Southeast Asia and ASEAN, but we also see a kind of a strategic ambiguity in the US itself. So, and just like Charmaine said, we can actually collaborate on climate change, and also there are already many existing working groups through, for example, ASEAN Defense Ministerial Expert Working Group, which I have observed for the past few years, and I think it has reaped benefits for the ASEAN member states, and that shall continue. And of course, if US-China so-called strategic competition is going to diverge away, but we also need to be mindful about some role players, such as Elon Musk, who seems to have a favorable policy towards China due to his investment and also business there. Tesla is trying to expand its market in China. And Trump even mentioned like a DeepSeek is not a problem. So I think wait and see would be one of the good strategy for us at the moment. It's not sitting on the fence. It's really about taking care of our own national interests while looking at how US-China competition and potentially some cooperation will be played out. So in conclusion, I think US-Southeast Asia relations may fill with many uncertainties. So it is very important for our governments and our regional stakeholders to also pay attention to how US-China competition will play out in other regions. So I've mentioned about how Trump trying to mediate conflicts, bring peace to Russia-Ukraine war and on Gaza, and actually how US managed the Gaza conflict would have implications for how for the Islamic maritime countries in Southeast Asia view the US. And in fact, it was their policy on Gaza during the Biden administration that strengthened the Islamic groups' position on this issue, and thereby we see a kind of affected US-Southeast Asia relations, especially with the Muslim countries. But going forward, we need to also think about other problems very close to Southeast Asia, like the Taiwan Strait issue, it's a taboo to be mentioned by our governments. But I think at least at the track 2 level in academic settings, we should start talking about it, because whatever US-China would do over the Taiwan Strait would deeply affect Southeast Asia, especially on the Philippines, which is the closest to that flashpoint. And of course, our own South China Sea, of which we try to bring solutions to, but struggle for at least 2 decades now. So there are more questions, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Hu, for your insights. I would just like to summarize your recommendations. So what would ASEAN need to do to respond to the uncertainties and the inconsistencies of um, Trump in his second presidential administration? So first, be adaptive. So we need to be prepared, and we need to study, be cautious, be prepared of a 180-degree turn in certain policies. So we should not be surprised, I guess. We should expect changes such as this. Number 2, we also have to be very authentic. So let's just be what we are. Let's continue to take care of our national interests. Let's focus on what is important for us. And this also means that ASEAN should hold accountable US and China in their decisions as well. And number 3, we need to be more proactive. Okay. For instance, Malaysia, as the current ASEAN chair, is spearheading certain engagements such as the South China Sea workshop and current negotiations on the code of conduct. The fourth one, no, that's the third point. Yes. So in terms of ASEAN centrality, so you also mentioned that we need to convince US, so we need to keep engaging them, okay, while at the same time focusing on what US is prioritizing, which is economics. So we want to convince that ASEAN is still economically relevant. That's right. And finally, you said something about wait and see. So it doesn't mean that we will be trying to study them and trying to be prepared on how to respond to. We'll also do in other regions, like in the Gaza conflict and the Taiwan Strait. So thank you so much, Dr. Hu, for those Q&A portion. And looking at the chat box, the Q&A function, we have received at least 3 questions. So I guess we will begin with the question from Mr. Alex Regado. I'll read it out loud. The Philippines has a lot of challenges facing at WPS. We have a lot of allies like the US, Canada, European countries that we can rely on. Is it imperative that ASEAN countries must be in the forefront to be united to fight this bullying and land grabbing in the region? As a tactics or strategy, can we ban their products or increase the tariffs like the US has done? Can the UN Security Council do something about the situation? So this is the first question. I think in as much as it's about the Philippines, Dr. Charmaine, would you like to respond to this question first?
Sure, Anna. Thanks so much for this question. I think I need to point out, though, that the Philippines only has one ally, one treaty ally, and that is the United States. We have a lot of partners, we have a lot of friends, Canada, European countries, the EU as a whole. So in that regard, right? So we have one ally, but many partners. About the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea issue, I think it's a little bit too much for us to expect anything more from ASEAN, because ASEAN has already done what it could. Like it's been able to maximize what it can do in regard to the South China Sea. We've all put our faiths in the code of conduct, and it's been a couple of years, more than a couple of years actually, and there's been no resolution still. So pretty much, the COC is like like I always say in conferences and webinars, it's pretty much dead on the water. And so if that is the case, what can the Philippines do to ensure that our fight in this regard gains support or traction from our other friends, partners, and our ally? There are workarounds that the Philippines can do. I don't expect ASEAN as a whole to take just one united stand, considering that we have varying interests and varying levels of relationship when it comes to China. But nonetheless, what's common amongst all of us are the other aspects of maritime security, such as combating transnational crime, such as protecting marine biodiversity. These are issues that are common to all of us in Southeast Asia, regardless of, the kind of relationship, bilateral relationship we have with China. Please don't get me wrong. Obviously, our fight regarding sovereignty, territoriality, and all that, these are all very important issues. The point that I'm trying to make, though, is that as important as these issues are, there are many others that are subsumed under this umbrella of maritime security that also deserve attention and a lot of cooperative measures. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Willoughby. And Dr. Winger, would you like to share your insights on this?
Yeah, just briefly, I think this could be a situation where we see a distinction between the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration. I do think it's notable that one of the most vocal advocates for the Philippines in the first Trump administration was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and he's in no way, shape, or form involved with the new administration, much to his chagrin, it seems like. And so, at least again, there are changes in personnel that could very much manifest in terms of how the United States and how the alliance functions in this degree. In terms of ways that ASEAN and the Philippines can proceed, one of the things I think is really important is the role of internationalizing this issue. So that this is not just a question of the Philippines versus China, it's not just about the West Philippine Sea. This is a fundamental question of the liberal world order. This is a hallmark case of it, of not just might making right, but there are rules that countries agree to, that have dispute resolutions, that there are court cases. That is a global issue for middle and small powers everywhere. Even going back to the origins of the law of the sea, that was Iceland and a few others taking on the UK and others to say that no countries have rights to the sovereign territory, forcing that issue. And so, as the Philippines thinks about future stages, how to bolster it, it's not just the allies and partners are key, but it's also looking beyond the region, beyond these immediate issues, to other countries who have similar issues, both with China in terms of the use of the fishing fleet, but also just who owns, rules, and controls sovereignty, and start building those peer-to-peer, Charmaine mentioned, spoke-to-spoke networks, joining other cases, finding partners who have a similar value, and building that up as an international system. Now, that the question specifically mentioned the United Nations Security Council. I'm highly skeptical of that for the traditional permanent member veto power region. But again, if you look at the number of countries in the world, middle powers make up a lot of weight, and the ability for them to work together to establish norms, practices, and mutual support can have real long-term benefits. It's not going to be immediate necessarily, but over time, these things really can pay off. And we've seen that historically, and especially with the time of flux, that's when you start building those networks for long-term gains.
Thank you, Dr. Winger. And finally, Dr. Hu, coming from Malaysia, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, because Malaysia is also a claimant state on South China Sea. So of course we watch whatever happened between Philippines and China very closely. So I know of Philippines' skepticism about ASEAN unity on the issue. This is because the extent of our role and claim is different. So only 4 of us are claimant states, the rest are not. And to try to force the non-maritime Southeast Asia country to also join in to make a statement about South China Sea is is a high call. And not only that, if Philippines wants Malaysia to be on your side, we need to settle the Sabah claim issue as well. So it was quite awkward for us to manage this. So the intra-ASEAN dynamic is another issue. But regardless, I think United Nations Security Council won't be the option because China is on the Security Council, and the panel on sanctioning North Korea was dissolved exactly because Russia was on UN Security Council. So not only we need to explore other mechanism, the existing one was highly frustrating maybe, but we can look at how maybe Malaysia as the ASEAN chair try to coordinate with the Philippines, especially because Philippines, China also have a bilateral consultative mechanism. So we would like having input from Philippines. What's the result of your bilateral dealing with China? How can we bring it to the ASEAN summit level, especially under the ASEAN-China working group? So I think conversation needs to be conducted, and continuity is also key to bring that forward.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hu. Indeed, it's, intra-ASEAN dynamics is another issue, right? But you have raised a critical issue as well with regard to Philippines and Malaysia. We can cooperate better, I think. We just need to find more constructive dialogue to get up further and go beyond our own bilateral issues. All right. We're seeing a lot of questions, so I'm gonna have to use my power as moderator to choose the more relevant ones. Just give me a few seconds. I'm looking at the questions right now. We have a very engaging audience. So I would like to choose the second question actually because it has to do with Dr. Winger's thought experiment. I think he raised this last question during his remarks. If the US leaves ASEAN to China as a sphere of influence, because we've seen that US is trying to like hands off, he doesn't want to engage, and if he doesn't want to engage, then it might just leave Southeast Asia under the sphere under China's sphere of influence. So the question raised is, where does it leave the Philippines? Will Manila continue the long fight or return back to the more Duterte-style model of accommodating China? I think he's more asking like the recommendation, what should we do if it happens? So going back again to Dr. Charmaine, first,
Okay, as a token Filipino in the panel, I will address this. Yeah, so going by Greg's thought experiment, right? If the US leaves ASEAN to China, where does it leave the Philippines? Well, that leaves the Philippines to the Philippines. I think we should continue to fight the good fight, with us as we're relying on ourselves. Again, I'm sounding like a realist, and I'm not a realist because but it does echo, right, that we need to find ways to rely on ourselves instead of always externalizing our security, instead of always looking towards someone to guarantee our own security. So whether or not Manila will continue the long fight or return to the Duterte style of accommodating China, my answer to that as an academic is, are the US and China our only options? Shouldn't our options be the other partners and friends that we have? Currently, the Philippines' foreign policy is actually to reach out to all of these different partners and friends of the Philippines. So I think we can continue doing this as Greg said, of internationalizing what we are experiencing and finding out that we actually have more friends and partners than we realize.
all right. Thank you, Dr. Charmaine. And Dr. Winger, being that your insights, please.
Yeah, I think that was extremely well said. And I think that's the key issue is this is a decision for the Philippines: independence, self-reliance, looking at other international partners. Um, During the first time that, well, the last time that there were major questions with the alliance with the Obama Duterte difficulties, Japan and Abe Shinzo was a huge help, especially during the first Trump administration, to again help restore and build up alternative networks spoke to spoke that can and should continue. And I think that is the key, is like there are options here in terms of self-reliance. Ultimately, the Philippines is the master of its own future. And the way it does that is by shaping those events itself, by investing itself, and then being able to take action as it needs to with who is and available to help them when they're able to help.
Thank you, Dr. Winger. So it's really a very big responsibility for the Philippine government, I think, in trying to address certain issues. We really have, if I may say, my personal stake as well. We cannot be really dependent on any other country, not even our allies. We seem to be on our own, but we have to vamp up our defense, for instance, and our diplomatic powers as well, so that we can have more engagements with more partners in the region, as Dr. Willoughby has said. All right. I'm choosing another question, but this is, I think, addressed to Dr. Hu. So, regarding your comment on Trump's seemingly appeasing attitude to North Korea, how can ASEAN and South Korea utilize the ASEAN Regional Forum, which North Korea is part of? Your insights, please, Dr. Hu.
Thank you. So thank you, Sun Young, for your question. So I think ARF is supposed to be the platform for regional stakeholders to deliberate on issues, including the Korean Peninsula. It has been an agenda of ARF since the 90s, following the first nuclear crisis generated by the threat of withdrawing from NPT by North Korea back then. So ARF is also the only multilateral forum of which North Korea is still sending representative attending, but the representation has been reduced to the in-country ambassador as of now. It used to be attended by the foreign minister. So we are not sure whether North Korea would be open to travel to Malaysia. And I think there's a complication because we are no longer enjoying bilateral diplomatic relations. So the only Southeast Asia country. I think there are still ways to engage North Korea if there is a will coming from the US to really introduce some initiative to re-engage North Korea, and then we would see what is North Korea's reaction, because if Kim Jong-un don't think it's a good idea to engage Trump anymore because he was greatly disappointed back in the Hanoi summit. So I think and ASEAN is very reluctant to engage with extra-regional affairs. So even when Kim Jong-nam was assassinated in Malaysia airport in 2017, it didn't make it to the ASEAN summit agenda, and it was already quite shocking. So even more so right now, I think we would be, and with Malaysia as ASEAN chair, unless something new happen, I don't think we will make it a very clear agenda at the summit.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hu. Moving on. So as I've said, I will use my power as a moderator. I have a question here regarding the Make America Great Again. So I will address this to all the speakers. How do you foresee the call to make America great again as advantageous to future global relations, particularly in light of strategic competition? Dr. Willoughby, please go first.
Sure. This is another thought experiment, and we'd like to put our thinking hats on. All right, so what good thing can come out of this? Well, I'm looking at prior historical experiences, right? So, for instance, what the Philippines has gone through in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea from 2012 onwards. Even though that has really been difficult for us, it resulted in a victory in the 2016 arbitration award, right? So in that framework, even though that seemed to be a very tough and difficult time for the Philippines, it still resulted in something good. So in the same way, the "Make America Great" slogan seems to be, like I said in my remarks earlier, it really riles up non-Americans. But something good as well can come out of this, in the sense of forcing different countries in Southeast Asia and around the world to reach out to other countries, other partners, other friends, other than the United States. So it can actually enliven international relations that are no longer centered on the United States. So I will stop there, and maybe Greg and Chuping can also give their ideas.
Yeah, there's occasionally comes
Yes,
up the idea of
calling on Dr. Wing.
oh, so yeah, the idea of a historical ulcers kind of things of how do old international systems die so that new things can replace them. And one of the things I think it's painful to say now, because I mean I like the liberal international order, I'm a fan, but this international system that emerged out of World War II was not necessarily working. Especially we look at various disputes, various questions, various issues of international government, it was starting to show its age in a lot of ways, right? We think about breakdowns in international judicial systems, dispute resolutions, failures of free trade conversations. And one of the issues I think that, in theory, and again, this is maybe the optimist case, is that the liberal international order couldn't keep enduring as a US project, as an American project with the United States as the central tenant. That politically in the United States, that was a massive backlash. Beginning in the 1990s, certainly going through global war and terrorism, the American people as an electorate were not willing to continue to send US money and US military forces, at least as it was portrayed, to try and bolster this international world order. We saw that with the backlash to the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia, and something that's really picked up since the global war on terrorism, in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, of the United States not willing to be engaged. And if we're thinking about optimistic things that comes out of it, is if the United States starts looking inwards, and then there is that prospect of the liberal international order failing or falling, does that now provide the incentive for other regions, other countries to say, no, this is something we value. We need to rebuild it to make it better and to have it so as it more of a global project than one that heavily relied on the United States and a lot of key components. And so, again, I'm not sure if even I believe that's going to happen. It's hard to be optimistic. But a potential positive outcome would be we actually come out of this better understanding the liberal order and the collective value it brings for everybody. We have more countries, more governments being willing to invest in building and bolstering it and expanding the franchise away from its core reliance on this post-war US infrastructure and US engagements.
Thank you, Dr. Winger and Dr. Hu.
So
Your
I
thoughts,
think
please?
this is related to another Dr. Winger's thought experiment. So I don't think there is only US and China's sphere of influence. So there are actually multiple powers rising as well. For example, Japan has enjoyed a long-term presence in Southeast Asia, and they are trying to do more. And the second leader that Trump met after he came into office is actually Prime Minister Ishiba, and the meeting was held as a great success as well. So I think in terms of how every regional powers, including like Australia and our other long-term partners, it is really about how we are going to have more inclusive engagement. And to make America great again is the same with making Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore great again. So we can actually understand where they come from, especially when every country since COVID-19 pandemic outbreak has been trying to increase national resilience in economy, in defense, in political. So I think if there is a converged interest by two or more countries, and they would work together to reach that goal, and I don't see that as a major obstacles moving forward.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hu. I will now be down to our last two questions. So first, I will rephrase the question posed in the Q&A chat Q&A function. How can the ASEAN member states navigate Trump's withdrawal from existing normative regimes like the World Health Organization, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, and others? Calling on Dr. Charmaine first.
All right, I'm trying to find that question in the list of questions. Okay, as a challenge to normative regimes, right? And
Regimes, yes.
America withdrawing from these regimes.
Yes.
I'd like to go back to something that Greg said earlier about the rise and fall or the death of international orders. So the withdrawal of the main architect, right, of this rules-based order that we've been in since 1945, the fact that the US is turning its back on it or withdrawing in certain aspects, really spells the very big challenge on the on whether or not and to what extent this order can be sustained, because the World Health Organization, the UNHCR, all of these are facets of the same order. And if we don't have the active participation of the hegemon, then that also puts into question the very order that it has created since 1945. However, that doesn't mean that endings or the death of international orders, it doesn't mean that they happen very quickly. That by tomorrow or the next day, we have a totally different kind of order or disorder altogether. All of these changes are incremental. So I think to make sure that the end doesn't come tomorrow, there are still certain things that you and I, the different states, different actors can do. Studies have shown that small countries actually do their very best, bend over backwards actually, to ensure that this current rules-based order continues to persist and continues to exist. The fact that the Philippines filed a case against China in the South China Sea is evidence that someone like us is still willing to fight tooth and nail to make sure that this order continues to exist, because we find legitimacy and protection and security in this order. So I think, while there will be definitive challenges with the lack or withdrawal of American participation, it doesn't mean that it's going to be the end of this order by tomorrow. There are still things that small and medium powers can do to extract benefits from this current order.
Thank you, Dr. Charmaine. Dr. Winger?
Yeah, I think those are great points. Couple one, it's not going to win fans. It's not the sexiest thing, but the money's going to matter. Like the U.S. funding for these agencies and the withdrawal of U.S. funding is going to put a huge strain on these organizations, the good work that they do. And any other state, every other state who values these things, who understands them, anything that they could do to help support them financially to keep them going, to help buy that time for a transitional system, I think is going to be really important. Again, the USAID, State Department stuff, it's going to be, the fallout from that is huge, and it's going to be spiraling going forward. And the ability for other actors, at least in the short term, to help bridge that gap in terms of funding, to even give time to reorganize, would be essential. I also think, especially if we're looking at the teetering of global organizations, it is an opportunity for regional organizations to thrive. So, as much as ASEAN can be successful, is this an opportunity that if the UN-based agencies are flailing or foundering, can equivalent agencies be established in ASEAN, in the Indo-Pacific region, that better reflect these ideals, that can help continue these missions on a local and regional basis? And then does that become the future for later growth? Hopefully, I would say, but in the short term, it's going to get really messy.
Thank you, Dr. Winger, and also for raising the issue about funding. I think that's also one of the main problems that we will be having unless other partners would be willing to pitch more. And finally, Doctor Who, your thoughts, please.
Well, the US is the biggest funder to WHO. So I think the reason for withdrawing from WHO is to stop funding the WHO. Unfortunately, I think China would see this as an opportunity and yeah, to fill in the gap where the US would live. So yeah, it's very interesting. I think for Southeast Asia, we do look out for leadership in medical health. For example, WHO is setting standard. It's not performing very well over the COVID. But right now, many countries in the Northern Hemisphere is now battling the worst flu season. So not only we have the coronavirus, we have novel virus, we have the common flu. So it was pretty disastrous. And at this critical time, the US withdrew from WHO. So yeah, I think it put many questions into, and ironically, US is still one of the leaders in medical health industry. So I hope the Congress would try to convince the government to roll back the decision.
Okay, thank you, Doctor Who. So on to the last question. So I've been looking at the questions here. There's a question about two of them related to Taiwan. So this will be our last question for the Q&A. What do you think would happen to the US-ASEAN dynamics if an armed conflict rises between China and Taiwan? So again, I'm calling on Dr. Charmaine first.
All right. So we're maybe offering, some thoughts about future scenarios. In case of a Taiwan contingency, of course, all bets are off. So that means that the worst case scenario has happened. This is the very thing that we've all been working to try to avoid. And yet, if it still comes down to that, then that means all of our efforts have been futile. But for a country like the Philippines, the first thing that we really need to do is, of course, to bring all the Filipinos back home. But then that puts into question logistics and operations. Are we prepared to bring Filipinos back home in case of a Taiwan contingency? Do we have the kinds of mechanisms to move people from distressed areas? One would think that we have had a lot of experience, right, with all of the typhoons that we experience on an annual basis. But actually, there are still plenty of things that we need to do, because we don't only have to deal with bringing Filipinos back home. We might also be dealing with waves and waves of refugees. So that's something, logistics and operations, that's something that the Philippines should be working on in preparation for potential Taiwan contingency.
Thank you, Dr. Charmaine. Dr. Winger, your thoughts?
Yeah, this goes to Dr. Who's point earlier, the sheer unpredictability of the Trump administration, in that how the Trump administration would respond to a major attack against threat towards Taiwan is up for debate. And it's a weird kind of dynamic of even like thinking through the personal psychology of it, which is an odd way to go, but like, is this seen as a challenge to his power and then, masculinity that he needs to respond to, and therefore the United States will have a big response? Is this well, Taiwan is part of China, so therefore why are we going to try and defend Taiwan? I will say, and again, it's hard to say common threads or commonalities or consistencies with the Trump administration. One thing that was common, at least through the first one, is very strong hesitance towards the forward deployment of U.S. forces by the Trump administration. Very much willing to use force in the form of airstrikes, in the form of cyber attacks, in the form of drone strikes. But in terms of the physical presence of U.S. soldiers outside of the U.S., this probably goes back to the Vietnam War, which he was alive for and remembered. Donald Trump seems to have a very high degree of political wariness towards that, which might make into it. Beyond that, it's not even a coin flip. It's a throw anything at the wall, because it's hard to say. And that unpredictability itself, I think, is important, because a lack of certainty in policy, like we could talk about strategic ambiguity as much as we want, There's a difference between strategic ambiguity and just pure uncertainty. And we are in a situation of pure uncertainty, which is its own type of chaos, anarchy, and decision making difficulty. And so it's never going to go away, but it is what it is.
Thank you, Dr. Winger. And finally, Dr. Hu, you mentioned
So I think
Taiwan as well earlier.
So for the past 2 years, increasingly there are more war games designed to test our responses to Taiwan contingency. So I have been lucky to be invited to several of those war games because they are trying to understand how Southeast Asians think about Taiwan contingency. I think as Charmaine has said, one of the major consideration is to evacuate our citizens. And would ASEAN countries work together? So that's and we haven't talked to each other about this yet because this issue is so sensitive to each government here. And I think we should also talk to other partners like the United States, which is very important. And some countries may wanted to talk to China, like would they open a safe corridor, humanitarian passage for them to evacuate from Taiwan to China? But when we look at the map, yeah, aside from China, Philippines is actually the closest point. And given how ASEAN did not come together on Philippine-China conflict, would Philippines then, on humanitarian basis, accept and receive and help evacuate other fellow ASEAN member citizens? So we should talk about this issue as soon as possible, and especially when there is a Taiwan TV series. I think it will be released on Netflix on 0 Day. So that drama is intended to heighten people's awareness about the Taiwan contingency, what China would do. It would take 7 days, so the drama series will start with day 7, day 6, day 5, and then day 0. So that's why it's called a 0 Day. So I think with, if it is in public domain, this discussion will be more widespread, then maybe government would not be looking the other way and try to face the potential difficult realities. And especially among the ASEAN member states, we really, really need to talk about these difficult issues together. Otherwise, the spillover onto South China Sea is something that actually Vietnam signaled that very strongly. They believe that it will spill over into South China Sea. So yeah, I think conversations on difficult issues are very important and critical at this moment when we are facing so much unpredictability and uncertainties.
Thank you, Dr. Hu. I'll actually be looking forward to watching that on Netflix. That's a very nice way of introducing the issue to the public, right? Netflix. Even the younger generations would probably be interested. Okay, I've been asked to ask your concluding words. So for everything that we have discussed today, all the uncertainties, would you say that we are now better prepared to navigate the second Trump administration? Just a few sentences would do. Professor Charmaine?
Sure. So whether or not we are better off in the second Trump administration actually depends as well on the level of commitment that we have in improving our international relations. This has roots and can be anchored in the kind of domestic politics that we have. So the domestic politics will always spill over to our foreign policy.
Thank you, Dr. Charmaine. And Dr. Winger?
I think it's going to be an interesting time, and that's cut many different ways. What I would say is don't underestimate agencies of other individuals, of organizations, of other countries, and the ability to be the changes that you want in the world. Yes, the Trump administration is going to do what it wants. There's no way to necessarily change that at the moment. Will be future elections, but it's not, the world doesn't exist for the Trump administration to do as it wants. Other countries, other actors, other individuals, agencies, organizations, even just in our own lives, in our own communities, have the ability to take agency to shape what we can. And I think that's the important lesson to go forward, is this is not just the Trump administration. Others can respond and should, and that's hopefully going to lead to other changes as well. Thank you.
And finally, Dr. Wu.
I think not only we need to focus on our self-resilience, collective resilience is very important as well. So Gregory shared the same point as I do. I think domestic agency institutions are highly critical. So despite what Trump, Rubio, and Hegseth talk about Ukraine and Taiwan, but it was the military institutions. So the commander of the Indo-Pacific speak up and said, it is very important. We cannot take this lightly. So likewise in Malaysia as well. So despite our government seemingly quite China-friendly policy, but our military, especially the Navy, is highly aware of what China is doing in our waters. So that said, I think the agency-to-agency coordination and cooperation is very critical. So this is why ASEAN Coast Guard Forum should be further institutionalized. I don't understand why ASEAN Secretariat has not institutionalized it yet, because it depends on the host country to host the forum or not. So I think not only that, we also receive many helps from our partners in strengthening our national security and interests. And I think focusing on joint interests is the most important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hu. All right. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have left for today. Once again, on behalf of Fax Asia and the Foundation for the National Interest, first of all, we wish to express our very warm gratitude to our speakers for the time that you have shared with us and your expertise, and for gamely answering all the questions that we have for today. And to the speakers and the participants for the very fruitful discussion. As I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of questions. I'm sorry we cannot accommodate everyone, but we tried to choose the questions that are very relevant and timely for this current situation that we have. So we hope to see you at our future webinar events. If you have questions or concerns, you can reach us via Fax Asia official social media accounts on Facebook, on Twitter. You may also visit our website at www.faxasia.org to stay updated on our projects. Before we end, may we also ask for a few minutes of your time to please answer the post-event survey in the attached link in the chat box. Once again, this is Ana Saberon. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat. Good day, everybody.